In this news roundup of the week for 23rd of September 2022, Russia announces a major mobilization of its citizens while repeating its threats of nuclear war. The UK's new government announces the unbanning of fracking and the most radical tax-cutting day in 50 years. And in this week's Short Thought, we look at the latest tech giant, PayPal, to exercise unaccountable power against its customers, apparently to the detriment of free speech. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. So, after a period where Vladimir Putin must have been considering the not especially good choices he had before him, it seems as though he has made up his mind and he has made his move. The Russian leader announced this week that he was moving towards a partial mobilization. Whether the word partial means much in that sentence, well, we'll find out. The numbers of forces to be drafted into the Ukraine war effort was given as 300,000, although it later turned out it could be up to 1 million. This followed very soon after the announcement that there would be rapid votes held in Russian-controlled areas, Donetsk and Luhansk in the east, and Kherson and Zaporizhzhia in the south. So rapid, they've already started. Nobody seems inclined to even pretend that the results of these supposed referenda is in any way in doubt. Even Turkey, which has been trying to keep relations on both sides, condemned the move. Such illegitimate fait accompli will not be recognised by the international community. But the point is that once they've been conducted, Russia will pretty much instantly agree that those regions should become a part of Russia. And Putin and others have made clear from that from that point, action against them could be taken as an attack on Russia itself. And you don't want to be doing that, they say, because if Russia itself is attacked, then all bets are off, and it will use all of the weapons at its disposal to fight back. Commentators in the West have seen this as an escalation. Logically, Putin might well be seeing it as the path to eventual de-escalation, if only he can draw the line around the existing gains that Russia has won, if only he can persuade the West that nuclear war will be the cost if they don't accept their becoming part of Russia, then the war can end. He will have won his victory, significantly smaller than he'd originally hoped, but not the catastrophic total defeat that would see the end of his presidency for sure. And Zelensky would rage and fume about it, but the rest of the world will tell him that although they sympathise, of course, it's not worth destroying the whole of the human race over. If only Putin and his supporters can persuade them that he's really serious, and if they attack, or if Ukraine uses Western weapons to attack these regions once they become part of Russia, it's going to be very, very bad. And we know he's serious because he said so. I'm not bluffing, he said, and nobody who says that is ever bluffing, obviously. And he explained that this was only happening because the West is trying to dismember Russia, which isn't true, and the West is using nuclear blackmail against Moscow, so it has to respond in kind, which isn't true. Of course, all that stuff is really for the domestic audience, many of whom, but not all of whom, will know it's not true either, but now know at least what they're not allowed to contradict in public. At least, not without significant consequences. So some initial protest broke out in the aftermath of the announcement of the mobilization. It was reported, and not denied by the Kremlin, that some of those protesters were amongst the first to get handed draft papers, which is a brutally neat way to discourage anti-war protests, I suppose. Don't like the war? Fine, we'll send you to die in it. And if you refuse, well, that's a 15-year jail sentence. Right now, it doesn't seem as though any Western politicians are buying what Putin is selling them. The logic as to why is reasonably straightforward, was unsurprisingly given voice by President Zelensky when he said, "Tomorrow, Putin can say, apart from Ukraine, we also want part of Poland. Otherwise, we will use nuclear weapons. We cannot make these compromises." President Biden used the occasion of the United Nations General Assembly to condemn the threat, repeating what I think most of us would hold to be reasonably sound wisdom. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres echoed that statement and also added that the annexation of a state's territory by another state using threat or the use of force is a violation of the UN Charter. Not expecting that on its own will be keeping Putin up at night. It came out today that the US has been sending secret messages to Russia to warn them of the unspecified grave consequences that it would face if it carried out a nuclear strike in Ukraine. Whether Putin sees that as merely counter-bluff to his bluff, who knows? Later, in a meeting of the UN Security Council, US Secretary of State Blinken refuted Moscow's rhetoric about others having caused the conflict, saying this: "If Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends." The question is whether an influx of initially 300,000 reserve troops will make a solid difference to the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine. The challenges the Russians have faced haven't been just about manpower, but also about equipment and ammunition and low morale and poor leadership. So it depends what Putin has in mind. If their main role is to boost the existing forces, to hold the current territory as they are formally annexed, adding to the weight of the disincentive to Ukraine to continue the fight, well, you could see how that might work. But the likelihood is that Ukraine and the West do exactly what they say they're going to do, call Putin's bluff on the use of nuclear weapons, and continue to push for counteroffensive to win back the currently held territory, potentially also including Crimea. That's going to bring us to a crisis point very quickly. It won't take long for Russia to declare the regions as part of Russia, so presuming that Ukraine makes no adjustments whatsoever in its own actions, that bluff is very publicly and very obviously going to be called early. And then what? One possible scenario is that a small-scale tactical nuclear weapon might be used as a symbolic warning, maybe to vaporize the uninhabited Snake Island, site of one of the most celebrated incidents of Ukrainian defiance. But Putin must know that if he digs himself into that hole and his enemies don't scatter in terror, then he will be left with only the capitulation that he fears the most, or else a highly likely suicidal escalation. So long as he doesn't cross the nuclear line, he can persuade himself that maybe some skillful tightrope walking can still get him through, bolster the forces to defend the existing gains, produce a stalemate over the winter, let the cold weather wear down the commitment of the European states, which is highly likely to do, get them to the point where they become resigned to the status quo, much as they may hate it, and start scaling down their support for Ukraine. It's not obvious that it's a plan that couldn't succeed, but only if a stalemate can be reached. And Putin's problem is that gap to that isn't measured purely in terms of all the human numbers he can throw into the equation. Meanwhile, a number of Russian men have been demonstrating with their feet that they don't much fancy being cannon fodder in this particular exercise. Footage apparently from the Russia-Georgia border shows long queues of cars trying to pass. It was said to have stretched more than 3 miles long on the Russian side. Flights out of Russia were fully booked within minutes of Putin's announcement, with costs for tickets rapidly skyrocketing in real time. Only a minority will at such short notice, and with doors being slammed shut very quickly, be able to escape. The rest will simply have to take what's coming, and this represents Putin's biggest gamble. Because before this, people were able to passively support his special military operation from the comfort of their own armchairs. The debate over whether it was a war or not was something theoretical that didn't really affect their lives very much. Well, that was then. Now the war has come home to every Russian household that contains a man eligible to fight. And although there may be some administrative confusion in the initial rush, some of those early reports suggest that men over the age of 60 have received call-up papers. So if those aren't an aberration, the net is being cast pretty wide. If large numbers of these men who are being snatched unwillingly from their families start coming home in body bags or not coming home at all, it could, of course, go very badly indeed. for Putin. Now, speaking of things that might end badly, in the UK, Liz Truss's new government, having been on pause for the last couple of weeks during the period of mourning for the Queen, has kicked into high gear with a slew of announcements and set pieces whereby it can look busy and in control. One aspect of that was the expected announcement this week of a lifting of the ban on fracking for shale gas in England. A moratorium on the practice had been in place since 2019, following concerns about earth tremors. But with the energy crisis, Truss has said that her government will be looking short-term to all potential energy sources to bring the UK to the point where it's a net energy exporter by 2040. Fracking remains controversial, however. All the opposition parties are against it, but so are at least some of the local communities that would be affected by it. And it's the classic challenge with energy supply. We're not much fussed about how we get our energy for precisely as long as it's located a long way away from where we live. But once it's next door, whether it's a wind turbine, a coal-fired power station, a nuclear power station, or indeed, yes, a fracking operation, then we mind very much. During the leadership election, Liz Truss promised the Conservative Party voters that fracking would be subject to agreement by the local communities concerned. In the debate in Parliament, a number of Tory MPs were there demanding to know, how is that going to work exactly? It seems a little early to be expecting a concrete answer to that question, as you would think it would be down to companies like Quadrilla to put forward a plan for the sites that they think will be viable. One thing that seems under active consideration is whether local communities might get some financial incentive to welcome the fracking operation in their community, maybe including paying part or all of people's energy bills. That's led some MPs to raise concerns over whether there'll be genuine consultation with those communities or whether they will be simply bought off. The open question is how much support there will be in the House for fracking, whether the numerous Conservative MPs will be feeling so strong on the issue that they will take such an early opportunity to rebel against their own brand new government, the one they'll be hoping will do so well over the next couple of years, they'll be re-elected in the next general election. That government. With all the opposition MPs united against, a sizable rebellion could be Truss's first defeat in the House, which would really not be a good way to start. The plan hasn't been much helped by the founder of fracking company Quadrilla, Chris Cornelius, telling the Guardian newspaper that he didn't believe that fracking would work at any meaningful scale in the UK. He said that when Quadrilla had worked in the UK before, it had found the geology of the country to be much more problematic than the shale deposits in the United States. The shale gas resource in the UK, he said, is heavily faulted and compartmentalised, making it a lot harder to exploit at any scale. No sensible investors would take the risk, he predicted. So why is the government so gung-ho on the prospect? Cornelius suggested it was primarily a political decision. They have to be seen to be doing something. And all that's even before you have to worry about whether fracking would cause substantial earthquakes. Mind you, any earthquakes coming from fracking will probably pale in comparison to those being created by the Truss government's economic policy, particularly what was announced today. With the government spending huge amounts on keeping the price of energy down, having previously spent huge amounts supporting people through COVID, the government is taking the unconventional step of going for massive tax cuts. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, has announced the abolition of the highest rate of income tax and that the basic tax rate would be cut to 19% from next April. Stamp duty to be permanently cut, a planned increase to corporation tax cancelled, national insurance to be cut, and a cap on bankers' bonuses to be abolished as previously trailed. This is the biggest round of tax cuts since 1972 for Heath government. Its dash for growth budget, it's not well remembered for its sound economic management. At £45 billion, the cut is a full 2% of GDP. Truss and her supporters have often made comparisons to Margaret Thatcher in the ambition to reduce the size of government. However, Thatcher believed in sound finances. The idea of boosting spending at the same time as swinging tax cuts is not really a practice you would associate with her. Commentators have suggested the government sees itself as having little choice. It has just 2 years to provoke real growth in the economy before the next general election, and that's the danger of setting your policy according to election cycles. Policies likely to have short-term massive effects usually come with medium-term massive consequences. I can think of only one country that in recent times has gone so gung-ho for increased public spending at the same time as making radical tax cuts. That was Sri Lanka. Now, there are many differences between the UK and Sri Lanka, which simply ran out of foreign currency, so couldn't afford to buy essential goods, even fertiliser for its farmers. But just because you're jumping out of a window with a different floor doesn't entirely mean the laws of gravity work any differently. The thing you can't say about the Truss government is that it's not being bold in striking a new direction from its predecessor. If it works, it will be the most remarkable act of political courage of all time. If it ends in a steaming wreck, it'll be the most egregious example of national self-sabotage we've seen. So it's pretty high stakes. It all hinges on growing the economy and doing so quickly, and doing so, by the way, at the same time as the Bank of England is raising interest rates to try to damp down inflation. Two priorities somewhat in opposition to each other. The markets didn't seem to be convinced. The initial response to the announcement was to send the already weak pound off a cliff. And this was how it also looked for yields on 10-year UK gilts. That sort of movement is unusual, to say the least. It would send up the cost of all that government borrowing. Now, short-term movements based on immediate reactions are often later reversed, but even so, the initial test will be whether it can fly within the Conservative Party, those Tories who were clustered around Rishi Sunak's leadership campaign particularly, because it's basically the diametric opposite of what Sunak was arguing for, turbocharged to twice the degree that anyone thought they would attempt. You should expect lots of turbulence ahead. And surely a few more surprises lie in wait as well. Let's hope there are at least some pleasant ones. I have been consistent on this channel in arguing for free speech. No censorship of opinions unless people are actually calling for violence or otherwise threatening direct, actual harm. I've had people challenge me on that sometimes, saying things like, "Come on, Mallen, it must be good that someone like, say, Tony Heller is off Twitter. He spreads provable misinformation, as you yourself have often pointed out." But that's the point. I believe the answer to bad speech is more speech, so I have defended Heller's right to be on all the platforms and then contributed that more speech to highlight where what he's saying is wrong. Because as always, the question is where you draw that line. Obvious harmful misinformation in your eyes may turn out to be no such thing with the benefit of hindsight, so who makes the call and how are they held to account? I can't think of a more stark example of a slippery slope than what happened this week. PayPal, the digital financial services company, has had a little run of banning people. It banned Toby Young and Toby Young's website Daily Skeptic. It banned his free speech union. It also banned the Us for Them campaign, which campaigns on behalf of children opposed school closures during lockdown. These bannings are all significantly further down that slippery slope. Now, there's no doubt that some of the content on Daily Skeptic website falls into the category of misinformation. Their climate content is just embarrassing and woeful, and I have occasionally contributed more speech on Twitter to point that out. Because some of the other content it's contributed, particularly in its incarnation as lockdown skeptics, has been pretty important. Some of it has been rather validated by recent events. So yes, Toby isn't always the most serious person. Yes, you have to trawl through some dross to get to the serious gold. That's an indicator of editorial indiscipline maybe, but to ban them for having financial services? The Free Speech Union is in a different order still, since it doesn't make any sort of campaigning case except for people to be allowed to express their opinions. I am a member of the Free Speech Union. When Toby Young's done some of his more cringy, unserious things in public, I have sometimes asked myself whether it's undermined by the association with him. But it has done some excellent work in defending people. It has genuinely defended people with views completely contrary to Toby's lot, as it should. And he made that happen, and I continue to support it. On what basis does PayPal, a tech giant decide the Free Speech Union has broken its acceptable use policy, let alone the Us for Them campaign? Well, here's the problem. We don't know. Because they didn't say. They declared the policy had been broken, so they were shutting down the accounts. It's a basic principle of justice that you should know what you're accused of so you can give a defence. But this isn't being done on the basis of justice. It's being done on the basis of raw, unaccountable power. The retort when big tech does this sort of thing, which I've already had repeated to me when I commented on this case, is that those concerned are private companies. They can choose who they do or do not do business with. That's not a principle that anyone supports in its extreme. As Fraser Nelson has pointed out, landlords are no longer allowed to block tenancies to people because of their skin colour. Presumably we agree with that. Bed and breakfast owners can't refuse gay guests. When it comes to something as fundamental as financial services, shouldn't that commitment to diversity include diversity of opinion? When a company achieves a dominant market position for increasingly essential services, does that change the obligation of the circumstances in which those services can be withdrawn? Surely. Facebook, Twitter and YouTube have become key parts of the digital public square. Certain companies like PayPal become key to getting it to work on a practical basis. There has to be an obligation that comes with that. It's not an argument against acceptable use policies, but such policies should be about what you use them for, rather than what you think or what you say. And if you break the policy, there should be a process that is in line with basic justice. People should be told specifically what they did that broke the rules, and it should be clearly, not ambiguously spelled out in those rules what you have to do in order to lead to service withdrawal. This idea of we're banning you, but we're not telling you why, it is the definition of unaccountable power. And it feeds uncertainty and then, of course, self-censorship. The UK government is currently wondering what to do with its draft online harms bill, which currently promises to punish tech companies for harmful but legal content. Well, this is the best argument I've seen that should be thrown out. Frankly, we need something that pushes solidly the other way. That social media and digital services companies should be prohibited from denying services to people based on the legal expression of political, religious or other beliefs. Yeah, some stupid and some malevolent people will use it to say stupid and malevolent things. We can deal with that far better in an open democratic society than we can with the tech giants becoming the thought police who take it on themselves to protect us from ourselves. All right. For now, I am able to keep making these videos, discussing whatever the important topics of the day seem to be, because of the support of people like you. That absolutely crucial community of Patreon supporters keep this channel going. They enable me to spend the time it takes making videos and to be relatively unbothered by what YouTube will or won't allow to be monetized. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.